Dark horse candidate Mike Aguirre may not be fundraising much, but his three main challengers for mayor sure are. We follow the money as Election Day nears. Plus, the long knives come out as the candidates turn on one another in an old-fashioned debate. And builders cry foul as City Council tacks big new fees onto new developments in San Diego. I'm Mark Sauer, and the KPBS Roundtable starts now. Welcome. It's Friday, November 8th. I'm Mark Sauer. And joining me at the KPBS Roundtable today are reporter Joe Girardi of our partner iNewsSource, KPBS reporter Claire Tregeser, and San Diego Daily Transcript reporter Dean Calverth. We begin today with news about the campaign money spigot. The latest fundraising reports are in for candidates vying to become San Diego's next mayor. It's something voters should pay attention to, given the widely accepted belief that money is the mother's milk of politics. Joe Girardi, you've been producing our Follow the Money segments. First, give us an overview of what these latest figures show. Your story today says about $4 million raised so far overall. That's right, Mark. And I should mention that these figures include both the funds raised by the candidates' actual official campaign committees and also funds raised by independent political committees that are dedicated to supporting their candidacies. The two cannot coordinate messaging or anything like that, but obviously it makes sense to consider them sort of in the same camp. The candidate who had raised the most as of November 2nd was David Alvarez. He and the independent committees backing him have raised a little over $1.5 million through November 2nd. Just behind him is former Assemblyman Nathan Fletcher. He and his independent committees had received a little under $1.5 million. In third place was the lone Republican in the race, Kevin Faulkner. He and his independent committee had raised a little over $1 million. And then way back in fourth place is former city attorney Mike Aguirre. His campaign had raised a little over $5,000. Okay, and way back, indeed, we're going to get to a little bit more on Aguirre in a moment. So raising money is one thing, but how much have they actually spent now to this point? They're spending the money almost as fast as they're raising it. The individual who spent the most is David Alvarez and the committees that are backing him. They've spent almost $1.3 million so far. That's followed by Nathan Fletcher and the committees that are backing him. They'd spent a little over $1 million. Kevin Faulkner and the independent committee that's backing him, about $925,000. And Mike Aguirre's campaign has spent a little over $3,000. Okay, we're going to take a moment and do a little correction here. Mr. Aguirre didn't file electronically, as I understand it, as the other candidates did, but on paper, and that didn't get posted to the clerk's website. So this morning on KPBS, that meant we misreported the amount that Aguirre that he hadn't actually filed in this period. So straighten it up for us. That's right, a bit of a mea culpa for me. Most of the candidates file their reports electronically with the city clerk's office. If they raise less than $10,000, they can file on paper. That's what Mr. Aguirre did. He filed it on time yesterday morning. However, it was not posted to the city clerk's website until today. So we missed that. We misreported. All right. And we've updated, of course, our story on kpbs.org, and it's all fresh and up to date. All right, let's drill a bit deeper here into the main candidates' money pictures. Let's start with Alvarez. Who's giving him the lion's share? Well, David Alvarez, in terms of his actual official campaign committee, actually is not raising quite as much money as the other candidates, but he is getting a ton of support from independent committees, one in particular called Working Families for a Better San Diego. They're backed by the San Diego and Imperial Counties Labor Council. They've raised over $1 million on his behalf, essentially, and they've spent a lot of it as well. They're his main support. Okay, and Nathan Fletcher, and also a Democrat? That's right, Nathan Fletcher. He's been raising money from mostly individuals, as well as some businesses. Some of the most well-known individuals who are given to him are members of the Jacobs family, of Qualcomm fame. They should say they're a big supporter, of course, of KPBS. That's right. Full disclosure. Yep, they've given him a lot of money. And in terms of Kevin Faulkner, he's getting a lot of support from business community, companies, and associations related to business. Now, do we find it surprising that Faulkner, you hear he's the lone Republican. GOP, the establishment back, the big money folks, of course, Papa Doug Manchester and the UT, et cetera. But he's really trailing behind the two splintered, you would think, Democrats on the other side. What do you think about that?
I think people might, my guess is people might be holding back from the general election. My guess is they figure he's a shoo-in either as the first or the second person that comes out of this next election, and that the general is where donors and everybody want to put their money.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I bet you'll see once the primary of Faulkner progresses to the runoff, which it's pretty much presumed that he will, more money will be spent then.
Right. And we're going to get into, of course, a lot of that in our next segment here as we continue. But what about what's been spent so far in this, we're calling it kind of a primary phase of this special election? TV ads, mailers, lawn signs. Joe, it's different combinations for different candidates depending on what they need. Huh?
That's right. And by looking at the expenditure reports of the candidates and the committees that back them, you can sort of get a sense for what some of the weak spots, perhaps, of the candidates are. Good example of this is Working Families, the Labor committee that raised all that money.
For David Alvarez.
For David Alvarez. They spent about $500,000 on television ads boosting Alvarez. Okay. The hope, obviously, was that David Alvarez, he's a council member who doesn't have a ton of citywide name recognition.
Right.
The hope was with the TV audience, you can really reach a large, broad audience with that. You look at Kevin Faulkner and the Nathan Fletcher camps, on the other hand, and they've mostly invested in direct mail pieces promoting their respective candidates, trying to highlight how they're the best candidate. Then you've also got some of the independent committees that are almost serving as the attack dogs. They're not related to the campaigns officially. They're not under the campaign's controls, but they can go after the other candidates while allowing the official campaigns to say, that's not us, we're running a positive campaign. Best example of this could be the Lincoln Club. They're a pro-business political advocacy group in San Diego, and they have been hammering Nathan Fletcher very hard from all sides. They support Kevin Faulkner, but they're independent, and so they've sort of been doing, I guess, the dirty work, you might say, so far in the campaign.
Yeah, I would say about not a single day passed at my house for about a month where I was not getting a Nathan Fletcher attack ad sponsored by the Lincoln Club.
Right. Well, it's a funny time for a special election here because most elections around the country this week are done, and we're going to launch into a general after this, but we got a big 5-week or so holiday period in between. Does everything kind of go dormant? You can't really ask people for money while they're trying to, spend money on their family's Christmas gifts. How does that all work?
I can't imagine things slowing down. I mean, I think that as soon as this election's over, there's such a really narrow window to get the message out. It depends on when the general election is scheduled. It'll be sometime in January or February, and they might have enough time in January to really pump up the message. But I can't imagine it slowing down that much.
Yeah. So, Claire, 5-week sprint from first of the year to maybe, middle of February until the next election?
I don't know. I mean, I would say this is at least in recent history somewhat unprecedented where we're having this election right after the holidays. That is the final election who's going to decide who's going to be the mayor. So I'm actually not sure what to expect.
Dicey to lean on people when everybody's just tapped out for Christmas, you would think. All right, we're going to shift now to another aspect of the mayor's race. No BS, that's how Voice of San Diego characterized their debate this week among the 4 main candidates. The news website set no time limits. They allowed no opening statements. Basically had no rules for their give and take. Claire Traeger, so you covered that debate for KPBS. Tell us how it went and what some of the highlights were.
Yeah, I would say it was probably one of the best debates of this election season. It was an old-fashioned style debate, more of just a conversation with a lot of back and forths, candidates giving and taking, which led to, of course, some heated moments. I would say one trend was that both Alvarez and Faulkner and at times Aguirre were all going after Nathan Fletcher because Faulkner wants to face Alvarez in the runoff and Alvarez wants to beat Fletcher and get into the runoff. So we actually have a clip of one of those moments.
All right.
I mean, the council did make bad decisions, and Kevin, you were on that council for 7 years making those bad decisions. I mean,
which decision was that? Which decision was bad?
I'm going to tell you. We've gone from the 8th worst roads in America to the 4th worst roads in America. There's been 37,000 911 calls, as reported by the Voice of San Diego, in the last 2 years alone that were not answered in time. And during that time frame, you can say there was no money, but you found hundreds of millions of dollars through commissions and task force and tax increases and other things to fund other things.
I don't know. This is all coming from the guy who lifted the cap for downtown CCDC redevelopment to give more money to downtown. That's Nathan Fletcher, all right, instead of the other communities.
So that was Fletcher going after Faulkner, and then Alvarez jumping in to attack Fletcher here. We, as you said, rather bare knuckles. It was a fun debate. So what other examples of people going after Fletcher?
Well, Faulkner has this line that he uses all the time where he says, "You know where I stand," which is a subtle hit on Fletcher because he's gone from being a Republican to an independent to a Democrat. So Faulkner's kind of subtly pointing that out. But also at one point, Mike Aguirre went after Fletcher a little bit. Fletcher was saying that he wanted to make it harder for the city to have referendums that would override city council decisions, and then Mike Aguirre weighed in. So here's what he said.
Hey, Nathan, I want to say something to you. You have recently joined the Democratic Party.
Yes.
And I want to, as a lifelong Democrat, give you a short exercise, a short education on, as a Democrat, we do not come out in favor of doing away with the direct democracy rights of the people.
All right. That was a lot of fun. Some polls out this week now suggest that Faulkner and Alvarez are both going after Fletcher, as we're saying here now. Tell us more about these polls. What are we learning? Yeah,
a poll that came out on Sunday was actually a big shift from previous polls. It had Faulkner in
and that was a 10 News UT San Diego.
UT San Diego 10 News poll, sorry. And it had Faulkner in the lead with 41%, Fletcher at 28%, Alvarez at 17%, Aguirre at 7%, and then 7% undecided. And so Faulkner is the Republican, Fletcher and Alvarez and Aguirre are Democrats. So it seemed like a good example of Fletcher and Alvarez maybe splitting the Democratic vote, but Faulkner in the lead. So maybe presumed to make it past the primary into the runoff.
Now, this is a big change from just about a month ago. So, I mean, these numbers kind of dramatically shift. So tell us what happened on the poll from a month or 6 weeks ago.
Yeah, so a month ago, Fletcher was actually in the lead. He had 30%, and Faulkner had 22%, Alvarez had 17%, and Aguirre had 9%. One thing to note about this newest poll is that the UT actually reported itself that they surveyed more Republicans than the previous poll, just by who they happened to call. And so that might explain part of the shift going toward Faulkner. But it's also, I mean, it's a pretty noticeable jump, I would say.
Yeah, it certainly is. And there was another poll, but again, that was, you had to take that one with a grain of salt.
Right. The Labor Council also on Sunday produced a poll that had Faulkner in first place and Alvarez in second place. But the Labor Council is heavily supporting Alvarez, as we just said. Right. So I think most people took that with a pretty large grain of salt.
Okay. And Dean, what do you make of these polls? How difficult is it to figure this out in this special election?
Well, it's very difficult to do any local poll. It's much easier to do. The bigger the sample area, the more accurate the poll. National polls are much more accurate than local polls. The ABC UT poll typically leans a little conservative. As Mayor Faulkner was always pointed out, if those polls had been right, Carl DeMaio would be mayor right now. It does typically lean more conservative, and as the UT pointed out, they interviewed more Republicans this time, even than normal. So again, big grain of salt there, and a big grain of salt with the union poll.
But I wanted to ask you all, Joe, I'll get to your point in a second, but I wanted to ask all about the fact that, okay, Faulkner's at low 40s here, but being the lone Republican, if he emerges, I'm sorry, Faulkner, too many F's in this, Faulkner, Fletcher. If he emerges then, you would think that the Democrats and 3 Democratic candidate supporters would coalesce over whomever emerges. And so I would think Faulkner has to get mid or high 40s, would you think, to get into a shouting distance of having a chance when we get to that general?
Well, this most recent poll also asked, okay, if it were just these two candidates, who would you vote for? And when they had Faulkner and Fletcher lined up, they had Faulkner coming out ahead. Again, Republican, maybe more Republicans took the poll, so maybe that explains it. But that at least provided some indication that maybe that's not the case.
Yeah. And then, go ahead, Joe.
Well, I was going to say, there's two things, too, to remember about that, is that this strategy that the Lincoln Club and some of the other anti-Fletcher groups that have been going after Fletcher from both sides, both as, on the one hand, you don't know where he stands, on the other hand, he's not a real Democrat, all of that. There are two goals. One is that Faulkner can get Alvarez in the general because they think Alvarez will be a much weaker candidate.
Right.
But at the same time, sort of a backup, next best scenario is to turn off Democrats who liked Alvarez in the primary from voting for Fletcher in the general. And they hope that if they can really drive up Fletcher's negatives, you know what? Some Democrats might just stay home in February, not bother to show up at all.
Yeah, turnout, as we've said before on this show, is a real wild card when you get to a special election like this, especially at this odd time in February. So 3 Democrats on one side, 1 Republican on the other. But Claire, you had a story that maybe it's Mr. Faulkner and they would wish it before Democrats.
Yeah, and this actually ties into what Joe was just saying. Faulkner's campaign is working very hard to promote him as a moderate even now because he's the only Republican in the race. They assume he can get to the general, so they're already laying the groundwork to paint him as a moderate, which for the most part he is. I mean, he's a social moderate. The campaign said he's pro-abortion, pro-gun control, pro-DREAM Act. I kind of asked for some examples of those things. They didn't really have very many examles because he's a city council member, so he's not going to be voting very often on
these
things
kinds
like
of
abortion.
national issues.
And, his campaign spokesman, Tony Manilatos, even sent out a tweet saying Faulkner would be a Democrat back east, which I think people had some funny reactions to. So they're putting in the work now.
But he's got the problem nationally because the Republican brand has been really muddied. This whole shut the government down, take the economy to the brink business. You don't really want to be running as a Republican right now, it would seem. In any race, especially for a big city mayor.
Right. I mean, political experts I talk to, first of all, point to San Diego's shifting voter demographics. There are even more Democrats registered in the city now than Republicans 5 years ago. Faulkner beat Republican Carl DeMaio in the previous election running on a progressive campaign. And the Republican brand is, by most accounts, suffering nationally.
So we'll see in the general if Mr. Faulkner makes it even more running toward the middle and running toward the moderates.
Yeah.
All right, we're going to turn now to a big issue the current leaders of San Diego tackled this week. And linkage fees, that sounds like some hidden cost the mechanic might tack on when your car's in the transmission shop, but this odd name actually refers to a vital issue in San Diego, affordable housing for workers in low-paying jobs and how developers and builders of residential projects have a responsibility to help pay for that. Dean Calberth, I doubt many people have heard of linkage fees, and can you give us kind of the high points and a little explainer on that?
Yeah, probably not many in the public have heard of them. The business community is totally around it. Linkage fees essentially charge developers a fee. I think they're beginning to call it a tax for to support affordable housing, and basically it's a fee that's set to how many low-income, moderate-income workers, or actually more lower-income workers, are brought into the businesses that they're working to develop.
Building.
That they're actually building. There's a whole complicated formula about how many workers per square foot and everything, and then it's assessed at about it's going to be assessed at 1.5% of the construction costs.
Now, it's been around for a long time, though, but at a lower percent, certainly, right?
It's been around for 20 years, more than 20 years, since 1991. Originally set at where they want to set at 1.5% of construction costs, but it was cut in half in 1996. It's never been restored since then, and it's never been adjusted for inflation. So they're basically paying this on 1991 estimates of their construction costs instead of their current construction costs. So if this immediately went into effect, there's going to be a 2-year phase-in. If it immediately went into effect, it would be a 500% pay raise in that fee, or up to 900% for some businesses.
And these sorts of fees, though, are common in other cities where it's very expensive to live, as San Diego is. Give us some examples.
Common in a lot.
And a lot higher, aren't they?
Common in a lot of cities, especially in California, especially on the West Coast and the Northeast. Not so much in other areas, but in San Francisco and Los Angeles and Sacramento, Seattle, Boston, the fees charge between $8, $16 per square foot. Here, it's about 75 cents per square foot.
75 cents versus $8 to $16 range in some of these other expensive
cities. And so even if it rises 500%, that's still about $4. It's still much less than other places are charging.
And the idea, of course, that they've obviously recognized for decades, because they instituted this in the 90s, is that it's really expensive to live here. And a lot of workers and the folks who are building things and doing many other jobs that don't pay very much, it's very hard to find a place to live within a reasonable distance of this area, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And the thing is, this is an extension of the mayoral race, because you've got Alvarez supporting the fee, Faulkner opposing it.
Fletcher not really taking a stand either way.
Yeah, marvelously fence sitting.
He can afford to stay out of it since he's not on city council. But Alvarez is, what he says is, listen, if you can avoid this fee totally if you just don't bring in low-income workers. Raise all the salaries for your people, and then you won't have to pay the fee.
Yeah, give us some better paying jobs here. Yeah, but that's not likely to happen.
That's not likely to happen.
Okay, so what constitutes a low-income job according to this?
It's hard because there are different definitions depending on family size and everything, and these are all calculations. But basically, it's people like administrative workers, cooks, dishwashers, et cetera, retail clerks. It's the people who are making, in the 20s to the 40s, depending on family size and everything.
And as we say, and it was a split 5-4 right down party lines on the city council, and a tough argument, tough debate earlier this week. What about developers? What are they saying now that the council has passed it?
Well, developers are threatening to sue. One of these suits would be based, as several other suits in the past have been based, on whether this is a fee or a tax. If it's a tax, then it needs to get public support, and it needs a much higher threshold. So they're going to, they're threatening to sue over that, and they're also threatening to put this to a referendum, which they're beginning, the business community is beginning to get practice of. They just submitted a referendum for Barrio Logan community plan. So, they're beginning to, on these 5-4 votes in the city council, they're beginning to really take an active role in opposing.
And go a different route and override the council, as it were. Now, is this notion of a tax, has that come up in other cities? Are there precedents, or what does the city attorney say about this?
Jan Goldsmith said it's a open question. He said there are specific definitions that city council needs to make sure that it's hitting. He's not sure because there is changing case law on this. There have been a few cases recently that are changing the definition of fees and taxes. And so he's going to monitor this. He says, I'll defend whatever the city produces, but you got to be aware that this can be subject to a lawsuit.
Claire Tregerson?
This is something, it's required that we provide this funding for affordable housing. Is that right? So what do people who don't want this increased fee, do they have other ideas?
Yeah, is there an alternative?
See, that's the problem. The reason that, back in 2011, we had this very same proposal, or very close proposal, brought before the city council. And Tony Young, who is council president at that time, was a swing vote against it. And he said, I'll tell you what, you guys in the business community, come up with a better system and we'll do it. And they didn't. And so now we're back to square one. And Alvarez is saying, if you come up with a better system,
I'll listen to it.
But
now, some of the developers are more than crying foul. They were saying hundreds of thousands of dollars it could be assessed in an onerous fee on a current project they were giving as an example. Tell us about that.
No, on huge projects, on huge construction projects, it can add up to $100,000.
What example would we think of? Maybe, I don't know, the downtown library, you know, some of the big residential. There's one here near San Diego State University over in El Cajon Boulevard that's been in the news. Some of these really big projects.
Yeah, it's you know, a major hospital, and hospitals are asking to be exempt, but because they provide public services. Yeah, that could add up to $100,000. A major biotech facility, you know, and you know, this is high-paying jobs that are being brought in, but there's also janitors and there's groundskeepers and everything that also have to be accounted for.
Factored into all that. So their argument is you're going to hurt jobs, you're going to hurt the economy, you're going to, you know, get people to go elsewhere in the county or elsewhere in the region.
Well, ironically, one reason that businesses have a hard time coming here, one of the first things that businesses list when they're looking at San Diego isn't necessarily high taxes, it's high housing costs. It's where do we put our employees?
And again, they've had several years to come up with a solution, and nothing there. Boy, I don't know. It's in the war they came up with the idea of Linda Vista, and they just created that. The federal government here, it doesn't seem like there's any viable alternative. Well, we'll hear more about that, I'm sure, especially if the lawsuits file. All right, that wraps up another week of stories at the KPBS Roundtable. I'd like to thank my guests, Joe Girardi of iNews Service, Claire Tregesser of KPBS News, and Dean Calbreth of the San Diego Daily Transcript. A reminder, all of the stories we discussed today are available on our website, kpbs.org. I'm Mark Sauer, Senior News Editor at KPBS. Thanks for joining us today on the Roundtable.